Poetry Imprisoned, Japanese Verses from World War II Incarceration. Just to give you a brief historical context of where these poems are coming from, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt cited military necessity as the basis for incarcerating over 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II through Executive Order 9066. And that order was issued on February 19th, 1942. And the majority of internees were Japanese Americans born in the States, or they were ineligible for citizenship because they were issei from Japan. The Army's Wartime Civil Control Administration quickly created 15 assembly centers out of fairgrounds and horse race tracks after the executive order was issued. Japanese Americans were given a week to tie up their affairs and report for detention. After these temporary detention centers, men, women, and children of Japanese descent were moved to one of 10 incarceration camps located in desolate sites throughout the West and Arkansas. And the images I'm showing you here are from some sources that I'll also provide in the PDF version. There's some really, really great articles out there and resources, digital archives. The primary source that I'm going to be using for the poems that we'll be looking at today is a collection called May Sky, There Is Always Tomorrow, an anthology of Japanese American concentration camp kaiko haiku. The compiler of this anthology is Violet Kazue de Cristoforo, who was a poet and activist born in Hawaii, educated partly in Hiroshima from ages 8 to 13. She attended high school back in the States in Fresno, California, and after graduation, she married Japanese bookstore owner Shigeru Matsuda and was incarcerated along with her husband and 2 children. And while at the time she was also pregnant with her 3rd child, which she gave birth to while incarcerated. Throughout this time, she and her husband and dozens of other Japanese American poets wrote haiku, which they occasionally published in camp newspapers and literary magazines. In 1943, her husband was sent to a camp in New Mexico after refusing to sign the so-called loyalty questionnaire, which if we have questions about that or we want to discuss it, we can do so in the Q&A section. Violet, her brother, mother-in-law, and children were sent to Tule Lake segregation camp and expatriated along with her husband to Japan in March 1946. After several years in post-war occupied Japan, she later resettled back in the US with her second husband, US Army officer Wilfred H. de Cristoforo. Whenever possible, she scribbled poems on scraps of paper. And she told the Salinas Californian in an interview in 1993, throughout, haiku helped hold me together. It was an escape and it let me express my feelings. So we all owe a great debt of gratitude to Violet Kazue de Cristoforo for her efforts in making sure that so many of these poems were saved when they might otherwise have gone away to the anonymity of history. Just a little note for those of you who may be familiar with the history of haiku before its 20th century iterations. This isn't exactly the same haiku as you might think of when you think of the haiku by Basho, for example. It's a little different than that. The modern freestyle kaiko haiku was developed by the Tokyo poets Ippekiro Natsuka and Kawahigashi Hekigodo in 1915. So, and I'm taking this from the introduction of the anthology. So as Cristoforo writes, for these masters, the substance of haiku is that it reduced a thought picture to its most beautiful essence with a minimum number of words, which seem to flow from heart to heart. So you won't necessarily see in these poems the same dominance of the kigo or seasonal word and the more sort of objective scene of where the focus is primarily nature. While we certainly have that, there's also a much more subjective perspective in many of these poems. They're very humanized, and nature and the human condition are really intertwined very closely. And also the rule of the 5-7-5 syllable phrasing is not as important for these modern freestyle haikus. So you won't necessarily see that same pattern. Although the translations, almost all of which the translations included here are Violet Kazue de Christoforos, are usually translated in 3 lines. That's the choice that she made. And I wanted to honor her choices. And so I have largely left her translations as they are. Occasionally I've inserted an article here or there where I think the flow might be improved. But other than that, 99% of these translations are hers. So this first poem, oh, and I should mention, these poems are taken from this anthology based entirely on my own personal preference, and I had a lot to choose from. And what I did in this case is I tried to select a variety of poems from a variety of writers at different camps at different times during the war. And so it's an attempt to sort of show you many different snapshots of what life was like and how the haiku poets decided to encounter their life through poetry. So this is while preparing to go to Stockton Assembly Center on May 12th, 1942. I forgot to fix that. It's not 1842. We're not in the early modern period. Sumite ko umi, kono ie sarantosu, shakunage saite aru o. Rhododendron blooms, about to leave this house where my child was born. Kashu kan tsubaki no yume utsutsu, seki o shitsuzuke, dreaming of California's winter camellias, coughing all the while. Manatsu mesu no kane ga naru, yochi yochi ayumu ko. Midsummer mess hall bell rings, a tottering child. Inochi aru mono ijou ari roa, kaminari, ame, kaze. For living things, disorder at rower, thunder, rain, wind. Natsu no hikageri, banpei kombo de ishi tataiteru. In the shade of summer sun, a guard tapping a rock with a club. Higasa hitotsu, baba no magari o toru hizakari. A parasol goes by along the curve of racetrack. High noon. Heiwa to naru hi o shinzu, kitsuzuki o miyagezu. Confident of peace to come, not looking up at the woodpecker. Haikyu no kutsu tsuchi tsuita mama doma ni oki, suika kuu. Muddy issue shoes left on the ground, eating watermelon. Tomo ni otta ni otto ni hanarete, ichinen haruka, kokoro wa kasumi. Together, separated from husbands already a year, heart veiled in mist. Kokkyo koko ni mo futari no nikkei no haka ari, dosemi no koe. At the border also, 2 Japanese-American graves, voice of mud cicada. Seimon no heitai-san hakkiri kao ni yuhi uke. A sentry at the main gate, face clearly exposed in the evening sun. Ko tsuamono, oh, sorry, that was a typo. Ko tsuamono ni yukase, harubaru seijibara ni hitori. Sons joined the army, walked a great distance alone in the sagebrush. Tomo ni kagiri aru hi no kite, chi no kusa aoshi nurete. The end of a friend's life has come, the grass green and wet. Sabaku ni mo shiki no nagame, neru no nemaki ni kae. Even in the desert, 4 seasons are seen, changing into a flannel shirt. Wazuka no ron kararete ari, Nihonji no hyosatsu aru ie. The tiny mown lawn, a Japanese nameplate on the house. Kibo no nai mado kara satsukizora, ashita mo aru. From the window of despair, May sky, there is always tomorrow.